Hey everyone, we're working hard to get our first 1,000 subscribers, sign up and you won't regret it. A week ago, my phone started vibrating like it was possessed. 3:07 a.m. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. I had work in 5 hours, and I'd been training myself not to react to anything that happened after midnight. If it was an emergency, they'd leave a voicemail. If it wasn't, it could wait until daylight. But something made me answer. A man's voice exploded through the speaker, raw, furious, slurring around adrenaline. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. I'd heard this voice once before, at a distance, in a parking lot outside a coffee shop. He'd been leaning against a truck with the kind of confidence you get from never being told no. My fiancée had gone pale when she saw him. Her ex. He was yelling at me to come pick her up from his place. Like she was a broken appliance he wanted returned to the store. I didn't ask why he had my number. I didn't ask why she was there. I didn't ask why he was calling me and not her. I asked one question, because it was the only one that mattered. Where? He gave me an address in a suburb about 20 minutes away. Then he said something that stuck in my ribs. He said she'd been acting like she forgot who saved her. And then he hung up. I lay there staring at the ceiling, phone still hot in my hand, listening for any sound from the other side of the bed. My fiancée, Kelsey, was asleep on her back. Hands folded like she was in a painting. Her breathing was even. I didn't wake her right away. I watched her for a moment, because my brain kept trying to talk me out of what was happening. Kelsey and I had been together for a little over 2 years. Engaged for 4 months. We'd started looking at venues. She'd made a Pinterest board with 300 photos and called it Forever. She'd told me her ex, Vince, was a chapter she regretted. An older guy she dated after college who'd been controlling, jealous, and always testing her. A man who would keep her hooked and then punish her for biting. I believed her. Because I'd seen hints of it. Her flinch when an unknown number called, her sudden stiffness when she saw a certain kind of truck, the way she'd freeze if someone raised their voice in a store. So why was she at his house? I got out of bed quietly. Jeans, hoodie, shoes. My keys felt too loud in my hand. In the bathroom mirror, I looked like a guy about to do something stupid out of loyalty. My eyes were puffy. My mouth was set in that line men get when they're trying to hold a situation together with nothing but force of will. I went back into the bedroom and touched Kelsey's shoulder. Her eyes opened fast, too fast for someone pulled from sleep. Like she'd been floating near the surface. I told her we needed to go somewhere. She asked where. Her voice sounded calm, but her pupils were already wide. I told her her ex had called me. The color drained out of her face like someone pulled a plug. She didn't ask what he said. She didn't ask why. She asked if I believed him. That question is what made my stomach tighten. Because it meant she already knew what he might have said. I didn't answer. I told her to get dressed. She moved like a person underwater. Not frantic. Not confused. Just resigned. Like this had finally happened, the thing she'd been waiting for since she told me she'd cut him off. On the drive, she stared out the window. Streetlights slid across her face like passing judgments. I kept both hands on the wheel. The highway was empty in that eerie way it gets before dawn, like the world is holding its breath. My thoughts were loud. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was trying to stir chaos because he heard we were getting married. Or maybe Kelsey had been there and had a reason that sounded terrible at 3 a.m. but made sense in daylight. I kept checking my phone for messages from her. Nothing. We pulled into the neighborhood and it got worse. Big houses. Neat lawns. The kind of place that looks like it's designed to hide secrets behind expensive siding. The address led to a 2-story home with a bright porch light, like it was expecting us. A truck sat in the driveway. A familiar make and model. My throat went dry. Before I even got out, I noticed something on the curb. 2 black trash bags tied up, sitting like someone had taken out the garbage late. And right next to them, an overnight bag. Kelsey's overnight bag. I'd bought it for her. Canvas with brown leather straps. Her initials on the side. She'd used it the last time we visited my parents. My hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard my fingers hurt. Kelsey saw it too. She made a small sound, barely a breath. I parked and got out. The air was cold and still. The kind of quiet where your footsteps feel like they're echoing for miles. I walked up, grabbed the bag, and checked it. It was packed. Not like someone threw random things in. Like someone knew they were staying the night. That's the detail people don't talk about. The difference between an accident and a plan is usually in the folding. The front door opened before I knocked. Vince stood there wearing sweatpants and a smug expression like he'd been rehearsing. He looked me up and down like I was a substitute teacher who'd wandered into the wrong classroom. Kelsey stayed near the car, arms crossed tight, like she was trying to hold herself together by force. Vince said something like, "Finally," and jerked his head toward the doorway. I asked where she was. He smiled wider, like he liked that question. And then he said, still not shouting now, almost casual, that she'd been inside all night. That she'd come over, to talk, like people always say when they mean something else. My brain tried to reject it. Like a bad organ transplant. I told him I wanted to hear it from her. That's when Vince's expression shifted, just a little, into something sharper. He stepped aside and let me see into his entryway. And on the table by the door, under a bowl of keys and spare change, was a small pile of paperwork. I recognized the top sheet before I even processed why it mattered. Because it had my name on it. Not just my name. My full name. My current address. And my signature, copied, not written, in that slightly too perfect way scammers always mess up. My chest went cold. Vince watched my face like he was enjoying a movie. And then he said something that turned the entire night into something else. He said, "She didn't tell you what she signed, did she?" My brain did that thing where it tries to grab the nearest reasonable explanation before it accepts the ugly one. Maybe it was junk mail. Maybe it was something from the bank. Maybe it was a weird coincidence, my name on something that didn't matter. But I knew what I was looking at. Because I'd worked in insurance for years. I'd seen forged signatures. I'd seen people try to turn love into leverage. I'd seen what just paperwork could do to someone's entire life. I walked inside without asking permission. The house smelled like citrus cleaner and expensive cologne. The kind of place that looks staged even when someone lives there. The papers were spread out neatly like they'd been laid out for me on purpose. One looked like a loan application. Another had a logo from a title company. Another was an agreement with small text at the bottom that always hides the real knife. My name appeared in multiple places. My address. My phone number. Kelsey stepped in behind me like she didn't want to, like gravity was pulling her through the door. I asked her, quietly, what this was. She didn't answer. She didn't even look at the papers. She looked at Vince. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Because I realized the three of us weren't in the same scene. Vince and Kelsey were in a scene they'd rehearsed. I was the only one improvising. Vince leaned against the wall like he had all the time in the world and said something about helping her get free. He framed it like he was rescuing her from me. He said she'd been stressed. That wedding planning had brought up old fears. That she needed an exit plan in case I turned out like the rest. He said she wanted protection. I asked Kelsey if any of that was true. She finally looked at me then. Her eyes weren't wild. They weren't pleading. They were tired. And careful. Like she was trying to choose a version of the truth that would hurt the least. She said she'd only come to talk. That Vince had threatened to show up at our apartment. That she'd panicked. That she'd wanted him to stop. She said she didn't sign anything. Vince laughed. Not a big laugh. A single sharp sound. He picked up one of the papers and tapped it. He said she didn't have to sign. She just had to bring him something. And then he looked at Kelsey and said, like he was scolding a child, that she'd done exactly what he asked. My skin prickled. I asked what he meant. Vince reached into a drawer by the door and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of things that did not belong in his house. A scan of my driver's license. A screenshot of my bank app, balance visible. A photo of my social security card. Not the number partially hidden like companies do. The full thing. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. Kelsey whispered my name, like she wanted to pull me back from the edge. I didn't move. I asked her, again, if she gave him those. She shook her head too fast. But then, in the same breath, she said something worse. She said Vince must have taken them from her bag when she visited him months ago to get her old stuff back. Months ago. She told me she hadn't seen him in over a year. I looked at her. Really looked. The lies weren't even wearing disguises anymore. They were just switching hats and hoping I wouldn't notice. Vince shrugged like none of this was surprising. Like this was how adults did business. He said he'd been burned before. That he didn't trust people. That he needed guarantees. He said Kelsey had debt. That she'd never told me. That she was scared I'd leave if I found out. He said she asked him for help. And his help, apparently, came with strings made of steel. My mind started connecting things I'd ignored. Kelsey insisting we keep our finances separate until after the wedding. Kelsey insisting I handle certain bills because she was catching up. Kelsey getting nervous anytime I brought up a prenup, even casually. Kelsey being oddly specific about how the mortgage was in my name only. Vince watched me process all of it and then delivered the line he'd been waiting to deliver. He said, "You're not picking her up. You're picking up the problem she brought to my house." He gestured toward Kelsey like she was a suitcase. He said she'd promised she could secure something before the wedding. Something real. Something that would make it worth his while to stop calling, stop showing up, stop stirring the pot. I asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted me to sign something. Not now, not with a pen, because he already had my signature handled. He wanted a recorded phone call of me agreeing to a loan. He wanted me to confirm my identity on camera. He wanted me to make it easy for him to claim it was all consensual. I felt my heart pounding hard enough to shake my ribs. I looked at Kelsey. She was crying now, silently, like she wanted the tears to do the talking for her. I asked her one simple thing. Did you know this was the plan? She didn't answer right away. And that pause was everything. Because innocent people rush to deny. Guilty people calculate. Finally, she whispered that she didn't know it would go this far. That she thought Vince was just trying to scare her. That she thought if she gave him some info, he'd leave her alone. That she was sorry. I stood there in the bright clean entryway, holding her overnight bag, realizing I'd been planning a wedding with someone who had already started building an escape hatch. Or maybe, a trap door. And the worst part? A piece of me still wanted to fix it. Because when you love someone, your brain does stupid math. It tries to subtract the betrayal and keep the person. Vince must have seen that flicker in my face. He stepped closer, voice low. He said he knew where I worked. He knew what I made. He knew my credit score. He knew my mother's name. Then he said if I didn't cooperate, things would get messy. He said he could ruin me long before I could ruin him. I didn't respond. I did something else. I took out my phone. And I hit record. I didn't announce the recording. I didn't wave my phone around like a hero. I just held it loosely at my side and let Vince talk. Because here's something I learned the hard way. People who think they're in control love the sound of their own voice. They don't hide the knife. They explain why they deserve to use it. Vince kept going. He talked about leverage like it was a normal word. He talked about insurance like he wasn't describing blackmail. He talked about Kelsey like she was a tool that had finally done its job. He said he'd been coaching her. That he'd taught her what to say to me, what buttons to press, how to keep me calm. He said he could tell I was the fixer type. The guy who wanted to be the stable one. He wasn't wrong. Kelsey stood frozen while he described her like she wasn't in the room. At one point, she whispered for him to stop. He told her to be quiet. That sentence, small as it was, snapped something in me. I looked at Kelsey and realized something that felt like an electric shock. Even if she was a victim of Vince, she'd still put me in the line of fire. And that's not love. That's using someone as a shield. I grabbed the papers off the table and flipped through them fast. My eyes caught on key phrases. Authorization. Consent. Electronic signature. There were dates that didn't match reality. There were email addresses I didn't recognize. There were verification steps that had been checked off. Vince wanted one last confirmation to make it airtight. My phone was still recording. I asked him to repeat what he wanted from me, like I didn't understand. He happily repeated it. He said he wanted me to state, clearly, that I agreed to a personal loan and that I authorized it. He said he'd forgive Kelsey's mistake if I did. He said otherwise he'd make calls. That's when I did the first smart thing I'd done all night. I told him no. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a chest-puffing way. Just a calm, flat no. It confused him, because men like Vince feed on reactions. I picked up Kelsey's overnight bag, walked back to the door, and looked at Kelsey like she was a stranger who had my future in her hands. I told her to come with me if she wanted. She hesitated. Again, that pause. Then she followed me out. In the car, she started talking fast, apologies, explanations, the kind of emotional flood people use when they're terrified you'll stop listening. She said Vince had been calling her from new numbers. Showing up at places she went. Threatening to tell me she cheated if she didn't cooperate. She said she'd been scared. She said she'd planned to tell me after the holidays, after things calmed down, after the right time. I didn't yell. I didn't ask for details I didn't want burned into my brain. I asked one question. Why didn't you tell me the first time he threatened you? She said she didn't want me to think she was damaged. I pulled into a gas station and turned the car off. I stared at the steering wheel for a long time. Then I told her she wasn't coming home with me. Her face cracked. She said she had nowhere to go. I told her to call her sister. Call a friend. Get a hotel. Anything. But not my apartment. Not while my identity was floating around inside Vince's drawers. I drove her to her sister's place, stayed in the car while she went in, and watched the porch light come on. Then I sat in my car and did the next smart thing. I called my bank's fraud line. Then I called the credit bureaus to freeze my credit. Then I filed a police report. Not because I thought the police would kick Vince's door in by sunrise. But because paper trails are a kind of armor. The officer who took my report sounded tired, but not dismissive. He asked for documentation. I told him I had a recording. He told me to save it in multiple places. I did. That morning, I went to work on no sleep with a cup of coffee that tasted like metal. My hands shook when I opened my email. Every notification felt like a threat. For the next few days, I lived in a loop. Call this. Freeze that. Change passwords. Two-factor everything. Pull my credit reports. Monitor for inquiries. Lock down my accounts. I found 2 soft credit checks I didn't recognize. I found an email in my spam folder from a lender I'd never contacted, thanking me for my interest. My stomach turned. I forwarded everything to the detective assigned to my case. Kelsey texted me constantly. Long messages. Short messages. Tears in emoji form. She said she'd been stupid. She said she'd fix it. She said she loved me. I didn't respond. Because every time I pictured her hands taking photos of my documents, or letting Vince do it, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. On the 4th day, the detective called me. He said something had shifted. He said Vince wasn't new to this. There had been other reports. Other names. Other agreements. And that's when my exhaustion turned into something sharper. Because this wasn't just personal betrayal. This was a pattern. And patterns can be proven. The detective asked if I'd be willing to do something that made my stomach drop. He asked if I'd be willing to let Vince think he was winning. Just long enough to catch him in the act. I stared at the wall of my apartment, at the wedding planner binder Kelsey had left on the counter weeks ago like it was part of our future. Then I said yes. The plan was simple, which is the only kind of plan that survives contact with real life. We weren't going to do anything reckless. No breaking into houses. No gotcha confrontations that ended with someone bleeding in a driveway. Just evidence. The detective had me keep communication minimal and clean. He told me not to threaten Vince, not to accuse him in text, not to escalate. He wanted Vince comfortable. So I did something that felt disgusting. I sent Vince a message from my phone. I kept it short. Neutral. Like a man trying to negotiate. I said I wanted this to go away. I said I didn't want drama. I didn't want police. I didn't want court. I said I'd talk. He responded faster than I expected. Like he'd been waiting. He gave me a time and place, a strip mall parking lot near a bank. Of course. Public enough to feel safe, private enough for quick transactions. The detective arranged for unmarked cars nearby. I wore a wire. My hands didn't stop sweating. I showed up early and sat in my car, watching people go in and out of a nail salon, a sandwich shop, a place that sold phone cases. Normal life happening around something ugly. Vince arrived in his truck and parked beside me like we were meeting to buy used furniture. He got in my passenger seat without asking. He looked relaxed. Confident. Like a man who'd done this dance before. He started talking immediately, explaining what he wanted from me, again, like repetition made it true. He said he had forms ready. He said it could all be clean. He said if I cooperated, he'd forget everything. Then he said something that made my blood go cold in a new way. He said Kelsey had been good for once. He said she'd finally admitted why she picked me. Not love. Not stability. Credit. He said she'd told him I was safe. That I'd never suspect her. That I'd always try to fix things. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I asked him why he was so sure Kelsey was on his side. Vince smiled and pulled out his phone. He showed me a message thread. And there it was. Kelsey's name at the top. Not a fake number. Not a burner. Her actual contact. The messages weren't long, but they were clear. Updates. Reassurance. A couple of photos, my documents, sent in a way that made my stomach flip. She wasn't just panicking. She was participating. The wow moment wasn't that she'd gone to his house. It was that she'd been talking to him the whole time we were planning a wedding. My vision tunneled for a second. I forced myself to breathe. Forced myself not to react. Because the wire was live. The cars were nearby. The whole point was to let Vince keep talking. So I asked him what he planned to do with the loan. He said he'd split it with her. He said she deserved something for putting in the work. Then he said something even worse, like he couldn't help himself. He said he wasn't going to stop at one loan. He said once we were married, there were bigger moves. Home equity. Lines of credit. He said marriage made people careless. And then he leaned closer and said he wanted me to go into the bank with him right now. To confirm something at the counter. That was the trigger. That was the act. I told him okay. I told him I'd do it. He grinned, already tasting victory. And the second he opened the car door to step out, unmarked cars rolled in like quiet shadows. Vince froze mid-step as plainclothes officers approached. No screaming. No Hollywood tackles. Just calm authority, hands visible, instructions firm. They detained him right there in the parking lot. His smug expression didn't vanish all at once. It cracked, piece by piece, as he realized this wasn't a negotiation. It was a net. I sat in my car shaking so hard my teeth clicked. The detective came to my window and told me they had enough. Not just my case. Enough to connect him to others. He told me Vince had been using girlfriends, exes, and partners as access points for years. Identity theft disguised as relationship drama. The next part was the one that hurt more than the wire, more than the paperwork, more than the week without sleep. Kelsey showed up 2 hours later at my apartment. She must have heard from someone. She must have sensed the shift. She begged. She cried. She tried to climb back into the version of herself that loved me. I didn't let her inside. I told her I'd seen the messages. Her face changed in a way I'll never forget. Like she'd been caught stealing and was deciding whether to deny it or confess. She tried to blame Vince. Tried to say he manipulated her. But she didn't say she didn't do it. Not once. So I told her it was over. Not a fight. Not a speech. Just a final fact. Then I told her I'd added her name to the police report. Her eyes widened like she finally understood that love didn't protect you from consequences. A few days after that, I met with a lawyer. I gave the detective everything I had. I changed every password. I moved my money. I locked my credit down so hard it felt like I'd put my life in a vault. I canceled the venue inquiries. I deleted the Pinterest board link she'd sent me. I packed up the ring and put it in a drawer because I couldn't look at it yet. A week later, today, I got a call from the detective. He said Vince had been charged with multiple counts tied to fraud and identity theft, and they were looking at Kelsey too, based on the messages and the document transfers. He said my recording was very helpful. He didn't say, "You're lucky," but I heard it anyway. Because if Vince hadn't been arrogant enough to call me at 3 a.m. yelling, if he hadn't wanted to humiliate me, to control the story, I might have married her. I might have signed my future away with a smile. Instead, I'm sitting alone in a quiet apartment, not engaged anymore, not planning a wedding, not trusting my own instincts the way I used to. But I'm also not trapped. And for the first time since that night, when my phone lit up at 3 a.m., I can breathe without feeling like the air is borrowed. Because the truth finally showed itself. And I didn't look away.